I'll keep this as finished voiceover text only, with the case named immediately and the pace held low. I'm checking the key public facts first so the narration stays grounded without turning into a citation trail. The Colonial Parkway case begins tonight beneath a quiet Virginia sky, and you are sitting with the old file open beside a small pool of lamplight. Settle in, because there is no hurry here. Only paper, memory, and the slow work of patient detectives. The first pages feel cool under your hand, thin from years of being turned, and somewhere beyond the window you can imagine rain resting on blacktop, on pine needles, and on the pale stone bridges of the parkway itself. The Colonial Parkway case has always asked for patience, because it never offered one clean path through the woods. It gave detectives a road between Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown, a road built for quiet driving, with brick-colored tunnels, river views, and long bends where headlights pass gently through trees. You can picture the place before you read another line: the damp smell of marsh grass, the softness of fallen leaves, and the low hush of tires moving over old pavement. In the file, that peaceful road becomes a map of questions, and we follow them slowly. You turn the first page, and the paper makes that dry, careful sound that old reports make when they have been handled for decades. The date near the top is the autumn of 1986, when Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski were last seen together, two young women with ordinary plans and lives that reached far beyond any case folder. Detectives would later work their way through their movements, their friendships, their timing, and the quiet spaces between one known detail and the next. We sit with those first details gently, because every name in this file belonged to someone loved. The parkway itself matters from the beginning, and you can feel why as you imagine it at night. It is not a busy commercial road with bright signs and constant witnesses. It is a scenic passage, a ribbon of pavement through historic land where the air can smell of river mud, wet bark, and salt carried inland from the Chesapeake. A car parked there might seem private or ordinary, or simply paused for a moment. That softness made the place beautiful, and for detectives, it also made it difficult. When investigators began with the first known pair, they were working in a different world. There were no phone records like the ones we expect now, no cameras tucked above every door, no easy map of digital movement trailing behind a person. You had witness statements, tire impressions, fingerprints, timelines, handwritten notes, and the quiet intuition of people trained to notice what others miss. You had shoe leather, long interviews, and the smell of coffee cooling in a paper cup while the detective read the same paragraph again. As you sit with the Colonial Parkway case, you start to feel the first reason it resisted easy answers. The road could hold silence. It could hold ordinary late-night traffic, a passing patrol car, a young couple talking, a visitor lost in the dark, and none of it would necessarily leave a clean mark behind. Detectives had to ask who might have been there, who might have passed by, who saw a vehicle, who noticed headlights, and who only remembered later that something had seemed slightly out of place. The first reports had weight, but not enough shape. You can imagine a detective standing by a desk in an office that smelled faintly of dust, ink, and damp wool coats, trying to arrange a night into order. One witness remembers a car, another remembers a time, someone else recalls a road, a shoulder, a turnoff, a detail that may be clear or may have blurred with the passing hours. The Colonial Parkway case did not begin as a legend. It began as work. That work moved through agencies too, and that mattered. The Parkway is federal land in places touched by local jurisdictions around it, with state police, park authorities, city departments, and federal investigators all holding pieces of the broader map. You can feel the difficulty in that alone, like laying several thin transparencies over one another and hoping the lines match. A clue that seems small in one office might belong beside a report in another. A name on one notepad might need to be compared with a plate number somewhere else. Still, detectives did what detectives do. They talked to families, friends, co-workers, classmates, and strangers. They checked alibis, followed tips, and returned to the road in daylight and in darkness. You can imagine them driving slowly past the York River with the windows closed against the chill, listening to the steady tick of the turn signal at an overlook. The file grew thicker and the quiet question underneath it grew heavier. Then, less than a year later, the file changed again, and we moved with it carefully, because the next pages widened the case without making it clearer. In the autumn of 1987, the Colonial Parkway case gathered another pair of names, David Knobling and Robin Edwards. Though their story led investigators away from the parkway itself and toward the James River in Isle of Wight County, you turn that section slowly because it shows how a case can expand across water, bridges, county lines, and assumptions. The details had their own setting, their own witnesses, their own geography. Yet the region was close enough and the pattern troubling enough that detectives could not leave the comparison untouched. Here again, we keep our attention on the investigation, not on fear. David and Robin became part of a patient review that would stretch for years, through interviews, lab work, and family waiting. You can imagine the shoreline air in that file, sharp with brackish water and mud, with reeds moving softly in the wind. A report from such a place has a different texture than a report from a paved overlook. It carries sand, boat ramps, river light, and the sense that the map has begun to widen. Detectives had to ask whether they were looking at one long pattern or separate sorrows that only seemed connected. That question is harder than it sounds. If you connect cases too quickly, you may force the evidence into a shape it does not truly hold. If you keep them too separate, you may miss the one thread that could pull them together. So the work becomes slow, almost humble. You compare without assuming, you notice without declaring. In those years, forensic science had promise, but it did not yet have the reach it would later gain. Evidence could be collected and preserved, but many of the tests now familiar to us were not available, not refined, or not connected to large searchable databases. You can picture small envelopes, sealed bags, typed labels, and the faint chemical smell of a lab where technicians did what they could with the tools of the time. Some answers simply had to wait for the future to become possible. The waiting is one of the quietest parts of the Colonial Parkway case. Families waited, detectives waited, files waited in cabinets, in archive rooms, and in boxes with corners softened by years. Tips arrived, were checked, and often faded. People moved away. Patrol officers retired. A witness might remember something new after seeing an old photograph, or might become less certain about something once said with confidence. The case did not stop, but it moved like a clock heard from another room. When you read these pages as the detective tonight, you begin to notice how much effort goes into uncertainty. It is not passive. It is not giving up. It is calling one more person, requesting one more comparison, checking one more old address, and accepting that the answer may not be ready yet. The file asks you to sit with that. It asks you to understand that patience is not soft because it is easy, but because it refuses to turn careless. The geography keeps returning, as if the land itself were a witness with a poor memory. The parkway, the river, the quiet roads around Hampton Roads, the bridges and shorelines, the water routes used by fishermen, workers, students, service members, and families. You can almost hear gulls in the distance, the low knock of a boat against a dock, and the muffled sound of a car door closing somewhere beyond the trees. Detectives had to listen to all of it, even when it gave them nothing certain. By the time the second section of the file closes, you may feel the first deep difficulty of the case settling beside you. The events were close enough to be compared, but not clean enough to be joined beyond doubt. The places were near, but not identical. The circumstances echoed, but echoes can mislead. A careful investigator has to live in that middle space, where the mind wants a single answer and the evidence asks for restraint. Then, in the spring of 1988, the Colonial Parkway case opened another quiet door, and the file became heavier again. Keith Call and Cassandra Haley entered the Colonial Parkway case through disappearance, which gives a file its own particular stillness. They were young. They had been out in Newport News, and then the known trail thinned into uncertainty. You turn the page and find the York River overlook, a place where the parkway bends near water and trees, and where their car was found. The detail is simple on paper, but it carries a great deal of weight. A found car can feel like an answer for one brief moment, and then it becomes a question. You can imagine detectives approaching it carefully, the air cool around them, the river nearby, The smell of damp leaves gathered along the edge of the pavement. They would look at doors, seats, windows, personal items, marks, anything that might speak. The car was not just a vehicle then. It was a room without walls, left behind in public view, holding traces of two people who were no longer there. This is where the Colonial Parkway case becomes especially hard to rest inside, because absence is more difficult than evidence. When there are no bodies recovered, there are no final locations to study in the same way, no complete physical story to compare with the others. There is only the last known movement, the abandoned car, the reports from people who saw them or thought they did, and the long ache of not knowing. For families, that kind of uncertainty does not close. Detectives had to build from what remained. They reviewed the party, the drive, the time windows, the overlook, and every possible sighting. You can picture a bulletin board with photographs pinned under fluorescent light, maps marked with small dots, and a detective's hand resting on the edge of a desk while another call is placed. A phone rings in an office. A typewriter or keyboard clicks nearby. Someone opens a drawer and takes out the same folder again. The York River overlook gave investigators a place to begin, but not a path to finish. The Parkway's pull-off areas were designed for quiet stopping, for looking at water, for breathing a little between historic towns. At night, they could be dim and still. You might hear insects in warm months, wind in bare branches in colder ones, and the distant hush of traffic moving beyond sight. The same qualities that made them peaceful for travelers made them difficult for reconstruction. You can feel the detectives measuring time here. How long could a car have been there before it was noticed? Who passed the overlook that night? Whether another vehicle was nearby, whether someone stopped, watched, spoke, or simply drove on. The questions are ordinary, but in a cold case, ordinary questions become the wooden frame that holds everything else. You return to them again and again because they are all the file will give you. The Colonial Parkway case also suffered from the fact that public memory changes shape. Once a case becomes known, people begin to attach later knowledge to earlier recollections. A vehicle seen before the news may be remembered differently after the news. A sound may feel meaningful only after someone asks about it. Detectives know this, and so they listen kindly, but they also test. They ask when, where, how, certain, who else was there, and whether the memory has stayed still. In this part of the file, the human element is especially tender. Keith and Cassandra were not just names in a sequence. They were young people whose families had to live without the simplest answers. You can imagine a parent keeping a phone nearby, a sibling hearing a familiar song, a friend remembering a conversation from that night, and turning it over for years. The investigation is not only about solving a puzzle, it is about answering people who have had to wait too long. And yet, even with the car, the overlook, and the attention the case drew, the file did not open. It remained stubborn and quiet. There were possibilities, but not proof. There were comparisons, but no certainty. Detectives could not build a case out of resemblance alone, and they could not ask a jury to trust a feeling. They needed evidence strong enough to stand in daylight, and for a long time, that evidence did not come. When the next box came down from the shelf, it carried the year 1989, and with it another pair whose names would be read in the same long, careful breath. Daniel Lauer and Anna Maria Phelps became part of the Colonial Parkway case after they disappeared while traveling through Virginia, and their car was found near a rest area along Interstate 64. You sit with that detail for a moment, because it shifts the road again. The Parkway is still in the title, still in the public memory, but the larger investigation now reaches across highways, rest stops, and the complicated traffic of a region where many roads lead toward water. The car near the rest area gave detectives another place where ordinary travel turned into a question. You can picture the sodium lights, the smell of warm asphalt after rain, the low rumble of trucks passing through the night, and the faint metallic sound of a door closing somewhere across the lot. Rest areas are places of brief pauses, with strangers coming and going, each one carrying a private destination. That movement makes them useful to travelers and difficult for investigators. Daniel and Anna Maria's case had its own facts, its own timeline, and its own grief. Investigators had to treat it as itself before placing it beside the others. You do not begin with a conclusion. You begin with lost sightings, belongings, vehicle condition, route, habits, and the people who knew them. You begin with the practical things, because practical things are what the patient detective can actually hold. The public, though, often wants the larger story first. By then, the Colonial Parkway case had begun to feel like a pattern in the minds of many people. A series of young pairs, vehicles left behind, roads near the Tidewater region, and unanswered endings. It is understandable that people reached for one explanation. The mind looks for order when the heart is unsettled. But in the file, you can see the slower truth. Similarity is not the same as proof. This is one reason detectives could never crack the Colonial Parkway case for so many years. They were not solving one neat event. They were trying to determine whether several events belonged together. And if they did, how? One person, more than one person, a known offender, a stranger, someone local, someone passing through, someone who understood quiet roads, patrol habits, water access, or the simple trust people place in an official-looking encounter. Each possibility required work. The tools of the late 1980s could not answer all of that. DNA science was young, databases were limited, interagency sharing depended on people. Calls, meetings, and paperwork. You can imagine boxes traveling between offices, copies made on warm machines that smelled of toner, and detectives leaning over maps with pens in their hands. The physical world moved slowly. So did the information. There is a calm lesson in that slowness, though it is a difficult one. Cold cases are not always cold because no one cared. Often they are cold because the evidence did not yet know how to speak. It sat in envelopes, under seals, inside storage rooms where air conditioning hummed in summer, and archive dust gathered at the edges of shelves. Years later, when technology changed, that same evidence could become newly bright, like a word appearing on a page under better light. As you read the Daniel and Anna Maria section, you feel the case stretching. The Colonial Parkway name holds the public idea together, but the file itself is a set of separate rooms. Each room has its own furniture, its own windows, its own quiet. Detectives had to walk through each one without dragging too much from the room before it. That is harder than it sounds, especially when families and communities are waiting for someone to say, with certainty, what happened. So the years accumulated. 1990 became 1991, the first anniversaries passed, then the 5th, then the 10th. People who had once been young investigators became senior officers. Some moved on, some kept copies, notes, habits of thought. Families gave interviews, organized memory, and kept pressure on the case with a kind of endurance that deserves more respect than any dramatic telling can give it. But there was one more difficulty waiting inside the file, and it had to do with the shape of authority on a quiet road. Many people who study the Colonial Parkway case have wondered whether the person responsible, or one of the people responsible, used trust as a tool. You can sit with that idea without making it loud. The parkway was patrolled. The roads were public. A driver might stop if someone seemed official, or if a vehicle looked familiar enough, or if a person approached with calm confidence. Detectives considered possibilities around badges, uniforms, vehicles, and the subtle ways people decide they are safe. This line of inquiry was complicated because it touches something ordinary and fragile. Most people are raised to cooperate with authority, especially on a road at night. If someone appears to be a police officer, a park employee, a security worker, or simply someone with reason to ask questions, many drivers will lower a window, answer politely, and wait. You can imagine the quiet scrape of glass moving down, the smell of cold air entering the car, and the small human pause before a conversation begins. Investigators had to look at impersonation, but they also had to look at real authority. That meant checking officers, park personnel, security workers, military connections, and people with access to equipment or knowledge. It meant asking uncomfortable questions carefully. It meant protecting good officers from rumor while still refusing to ignore a possibility. In a case like this, even trust itself becomes evidence to be examined. The Colonial Parkway case also unfolded near communities with military presence, colleges, shipyards, waterways, and heavy movement in and out of the region. People arrived for school, work, service, training, tourism, and family. A suspect could be local deeply familiar with back roads and boat landings, or transient, present long enough to pass through several lives without leaving a lasting name. The region's mobility widened the suspect pool until it became almost misty at the edges. You can see why detectives returned to vehicles again and again. A car or truck can place someone near a scene, but only if someone saw it clearly, wrote it down, and remembered it accurately. Color changes under streetlights, models blur in memory, a distinctive plate may be noticed, or it may not. In an old report, a vehicle description can feel like a hand reaching through fog, useful, but never quite enough by itself. The sensory world of these files is full of small things. Paper clips leaving rust marks, photographs curling at the corners, cassette tapes with interviews stored in plastic cases, maps folded until their creases become soft, a detective's handwriting changing from careful print to hurried notes as a witness talks faster. These details do not solve the case, but they remind you how human the work was. People were trying to hold on to time before it slipped further away. And time did slip. Witnesses aged, memories thinned. Some possible suspects died. Evidence remained, but the context around it became harder to recover. A house was sold, a car was scrapped, a marina changed hands, a road was resurfaced. The physical world quietly erased itself, not out of malice, but because that is what years do. The Colonial Parkway case had to survive that natural fading. Still, the file was not forgotten. It was opened, reviewed, discussed, and reopened. Cold case work often looks from the outside like nothing is happening. From inside the file, it is different. You compare names. You recheck lab submissions. You call another agency. You ask whether a sample can be tested with the newer method. You read a statement from 1987 and notice a sentence that did not stand out before. Then you place a small mark beside it and keep going. Years later, technology would shift the light over the Colonial Parkway case, and we moved toward that path gently, because even answers can arrive with unfinished edges. When the light shifted, it did not flood the room all at once. It arrived more like morning through blinds, in narrow lines, touching one envelope, then another, and asking detectives to look again. You can imagine a cold case investigator standing in a property room, with the air cool and dry around the shelves, reading labels that had been written by another hand long ago. In the Colonial Parkway case, the future came quietly, through lab work, preservation, and the long patience of evidence that had waited for better questions. By the time genetic testing had changed what investigators could ask, the old files had already lived several lives. They had been active investigations, then difficult investigations, then cold cases, with new hope placed carefully beside old restraint. You turn a page and feel the difference between then and now, between a report typed in the late 1980s and a modern lab request written with newer possibilities in mind. The paper may look similar, but the tools behind it have changed. Still, even technology does not make an old case simple. A sample must have been collected. It must have been preserved well enough. It must be connected clearly to the case, not introduced by accident, not explained away by ordinary contact, not left floating without context. You can feel the discipline in that. Detectives do not merely ask whether a name appears. They ask how, where, when, and whether the answer can bear the weight of truth. The Colonial Parkway case had always lived with the burden of comparison, and DNA did not remove that burden entirely. It sharpened some lines and left others pale. For the cases connected to David Knobling, Robin Edwards, Daniel Lauer, and Anna Maria Phelps, later forensic work pointed toward Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., a man who had died years before his name was announced. You can sit with that slowly, because an answer arriving after a suspect's death has a strange stillness. There is relief in such an answer, but it is not simple relief. You can imagine families hearing a name after decades, hearing it spoken in an official room, perhaps under bright lights that hum softly overhead. The file that had seemed open in every direction suddenly had one firm line running through part of it. Yet, no courtroom would follow. No questions could be asked across a table. No sentence could be answered by the person whose name had come forward at last. Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. was described as someone familiar with the waterways of the region. A working man with access to boats, rivers, and quiet edges where land meets water. You can feel why investigators would look closely at that geography. The James River, the York River, the roads between them, the marshy margins, the docks, the ramps, and the hidden practical knowledge of tides all form a map beneath the official map. A person who knows water knows places other people only pass. In the file, geography becomes almost tactile. You feel damp rope under a hand, you smell fuel, river mud, and weathered wood. You hear gulls above a landing and the hollow knock of a boat against pilings. These are not dramatic sounds. They are the ordinary sounds of the region, and that is exactly why they matter. Detectives had to ask who moved through those places naturally, without looking unusual to anyone nearby. The name Wilmer did not solve the whole Colonial Parkway case, and that is one of the most important quiet truths in the file. It gave shape to some long open deaths, according to investigators, but it did not close every page people had placed under that familiar title. Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski remained a different question. Keith Cole and Cassandra Haley remained missing. You sit with that distinction because careful detective work depends on it. A public story often wants a single ending. A case file rarely offers one. You may hear the phrase Colonial Parkway case and imagine one sealed box, one offender, one solved or unsolved label printed across the lid. But when you open the actual papers, you find separate folders, separate families, separate roads, and separate evidentiary problems. Some pages answer one another. Some only resemble one another from a distance. The patient detective keeps them near, but not fused. That restraint is one reason the case remained difficult for so long. Detectives had to resist the comfort of a complete pattern when the evidence only supported part of it. You can picture a conference table covered with folders, paper cups, legal pads, and photographs turned face down out of respect. Someone says a name. Someone else points to a date. Another investigator reminds the room that the strongest link in one pair does not automatically carry into another. The work stays quiet and exact. When you return to the earliest known victims, Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski, the Colonial Parkway case feels different again. Their car was found near the Parkway in October of 1986, and that setting remains central to the public memory of the case. The old road, the pull-off, the federal land, the autumn air, and the early uncertainty all gather around their names. You can imagine the trees thinning near the water, and the cold smell of leaves beginning to break down. Detectives had to begin with what could be known, where they had been, who had seen them, what time mattered, what their plans might have been, what the car could tell them, what the scene could not tell them. You feel the limits almost immediately, because a scenic road at night is not a sealed room. It is open to weather, traffic, chance, hesitation, and strangers whose names no one may ever learn. Evidence from that first scene had to survive not only time, but the assumptions of its own era. Investigators collected what they understood to collect, preserved what they knew might matter, and documented what their training told them to document. That is not a criticism. It is a reality of time. Every generation of detective work is limited by its tools, its methods, and the questions it has learned to ask. You can only leave a message for the future if you know the future might need it. There is something deeply human about that. A detective in 1986 could not know exactly what a laboratory in 2024 might be able to do. Still, that detective could seal an item, label it, store it, and hope that the care taken then would mean something later. You can picture the evidence tape pressed down with firm fingers, the ink drying on a label, and the envelope joining others under fluorescent light. It was ordinary work, and it mattered. The earliest section of the Colonial Parkway case also carried the difficulty of jurisdiction. When a case touches federal land, local roads, state resources, and nearby communities, coordination becomes part of the investigation itself. You can feel the paper trail lengthen. Reports must be shared. Calls must be returned. Agencies must agree on what belongs where. A detail held in one office may not immediately reach the person who needs it most. No one has to be careless for a system to become slow. For a half-asleep listener, and for the quiet detective you are tonight, this may be the central feeling of the case. Not chaos, not spectacle. Slowness. the kind of slowness that comes from old technology, fragmented geography, human memory, and the dignity of proof. Detectives could not simply name a person because a pattern felt persuasive. They had to build something that would hold. Then you think again of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley, and the file opens into absence once more. Their names remain among the most difficult pages because disappearance removes so many of the ordinary anchors investigators rely upon. Their car at the York River Overlook gave the case a location, but not an ending. You can see that overlook at night, the rail damp with mist, the river spreading dark and flat beyond the trees, and the air carrying the smell of wet earth. A vehicle left behind can seem to speak, but sometimes it speaks in fragments. It may show where someone was, or where someone wanted it to appear they had been. It may hold belongings, prints, fibers, or nothing that leads anywhere firm. Detectives had to read it closely, yet cautiously. Every surface had to be considered, and every conclusion had to be earned. You can almost hear camera shutters clicking, soft footsteps on pavement, and a radio murmuring low from a patrol car. With Keith and Cassandra, the absence of recovered remains made later forensic breakthroughs harder. DNA can reopen a case only when there is something to test, something linked clearly enough to the event. Without a final location, without a recovered body, without certain physical evidence, the path narrows. Investigators may still follow tips, compare suspects, review vehicles and search landscapes, but the file keeps returning to its central silence. Where did they go after the overlook? That question would have been asked in many rooms, by many people, over many years. You can imagine family members learning to answer reporters with weary steadiness, detectives choosing their words carefully, and volunteers scanning woods or water with hope kept quiet, because hope can be painful. The Colonial Parkway case in this section is not only an investigation, it is a long practice of living beside an unfinished sentence. And perhaps that is why the case stayed in public memory. It was not only the number of victims, or the beautiful road, or the long years without answers. It was the combination of ordinary youth and unfinished detail. A car found, a night out, a scenic overlook, a road meant for history and calm travel. These are things people understand. They are simple enough to imagine, and that makes the missing answers feel closer. Detectives, though, had to keep imagination in its proper place. Imagination helps you generate possibilities, but it cannot become evidence. You may picture someone using a badge, or a boat, or a familiar road, or a calm voice at a window. Each picture has to be tested against what is known. If it cannot be tested, it must remain a possibility, not a conclusion. The file teaches that again and again. When you return to the later identification of Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., in connection with some of the cases long discussed beside the Parkway, you feel another kind of difficulty. A name can clarify and complicate at the same time. It may explain why water mattered. It may explain why some locations were chosen. It may connect evidence that had waited for decades, but it may also reveal that the public's single case was, in truth, more than one investigation braided together by place, time, and fear. That kind of partial resolution can be emotionally hard. You can imagine a detective who spent years comparing all four pairs, only to learn that the evidence supports a link for some, but not all. There is gratitude for what has been answered, and discipline around what has not. The file does not let you round the corners. It asks you to keep the shape exact, even when exactness leaves sorrow in the room. The Colonial Parkway case could never be cracked as one clean story, because it may never have been one clean story. That is not a failure of care. It is the plain difficulty of working backward through time with partial evidence. Some clues belonged together. Some may have merely stood near one another in the same uneasy decade. A detective has to accept both possibilities, sometimes in the same breath, and keep reading. You can sense how public pressure shaped the investigation too. Once a case receives a name, the name becomes a container. The Colonial Parkway case became a phrase people could remember, repeat, and search for in newspapers or broadcasts. That helped keep attention on the victims. It also encouraged people to see unity where investigators still needed proof. The title held memory, but it could also cast a shadow over differences. The first pair, the second pair, The missing pair and the fourth pair each required their own care. Different scenes, different jurisdictions, different evidence, different witness pools, different possibilities. When you lay the pages side by side, your mind looks for rhythm. Yet the detective's task is to ask whether the rhythm is real or whether it is produced by your own need for order. That question sits very quietly in the margins. The file room itself becomes part of the story after enough years. You can imagine metal cabinets with labels fading at the edges, archive boxes stacked on shelves, and a small desk where someone has placed a pencil, a magnifying glass, and a cup of coffee gone lukewarm. The air smells of paper and dust. The light is practical rather than warm. Somewhere, an old air vent hums. This is not where dramas happen. This is where persistence lives. Persistence in the Colonial Parkway case meant returning to witnesses who had already been interviewed. It meant asking whether new technology could revisit old evidence. It meant examining suspects who had emerged in other cases. It meant comparing behavioral details without letting them outrun physical proof. It meant reading press clippings, maps, lab notes, and old letters from the public. Some letters may have been sincere, some may have been confused, some may have been cruel or useless. All had to be assessed. You can feel the emotional discipline required to handle tips in a famous cold case. A tip may arrive from someone who truly remembers a truck, a name, a workplace rumor, or a strange conversation. Another may come from someone who has convinced themselves after years of watching television. Detectives cannot dismiss too quickly, and they cannot believe too quickly. They must listen, document, compare, and keep moving through the pile. In the quiet of our imagined room, you take one of those tips and place it beside a timeline. The sound is small, paper against paper. You check whether the person named was alive, local, mobile, employed, known to drive a certain vehicle, known to spend time near the river, or known to resemble any witness description. Then you check whether that information truly belongs to this case. The work is slow because truth is specific. The Colonial Parkway itself remains almost dreamlike in the background, which can make the case feel stranger than it is. It was designed to be scenic and reflective, connecting places of American history with a gentle, carefully managed landscape. Stonework, wooded shoulders, river glimpses, and broad curves invite a slower kind of driving. You can see why people went there to talk, to sit, to look at the water, or to take the long way home. But a beautiful place is still a real place. Patrol schedules vary. Cars come and go. People make choices that seem normal in the moment and meaningful only later. The road does not remember license plates. The trees do not keep voices. Rain can soften tracks. Wind can move paper. Time can carry away the smell of fuel, the warmth of an engine, the pressure of a shoe in damp soil. Detectives worked against all of that. When people ask why detectives could never crack the Colonial Parkway case, they often imagine one missing clue. But the answer is broader and quieter. It was not one locked door. It was many half-open doors, each leading to a room with too little light. The cases crossed boundaries, depended on aging memories, lacked modern surveillance, and may not all have shared a single offender. The difficulty was not dramatic. It was structural, practical, and deeply human. You turn again to the families, because no investigation can be understood without them. Families remember differently than files do. They remember birthdays, habits, voices, favorite shirts, the sound of footsteps in a hallway, the way someone laughed when tired. The file preserves what can be written down. A family preserves what cannot. Detectives had to move between those worlds, keeping compassion close while asking questions that could not be easy. In long cold cases, families often become guardians of continuity. They keep photographs safe. They speak names aloud. They correct errors. They ask agencies to keep trying. They endure anniversaries that arrive with no new answers. And they learn the particular ache of hearing that a lead is being checked, then waiting again. You can imagine a kitchen table with newspaper clippings spread across it, one lamp glowing late, and a hand resting on a photograph. The Colonial Parkway case asked that kind of endurance from more than one family. For those connected to the cases later attributed to Wilmer, there was the strange arrival of a name after decades. For the families of Kathleen Thomas, Rebecca Dowski, Keith Call, and Cassandra Haley, there remained the hard knowledge that not every question had come with it. You can sit with both truths. Partial answers matter, and partial answers still leave room cold. Detectives also carry cases in ways that are rarely visible. An investigator may retire but remember a detail while washing dishes, driving at dusk, or passing a road sign that brings back the map. You can imagine someone years later opening a drawer and finding an old notebook, the ink faded but legible, and pausing longer than expected. Some cases become part of a person's inner furniture. They are not always spoken about, but they are still there. The patient side of detective work is often made a repetition. Read the statement again, look at the map again, compare the timeline again, call the lab again, ask whether the evidence can be tested again. None of these actions sounds grand, yet this is how old cases move. A breakthrough may be announced in one day, but it is prepared by years of small, careful returns to the same stubborn material. In the Colonial Parkway case, those returns had to account for changing forensic standards. Evidence collected decades earlier may not have been gathered with today's sensitivity in mind. A surface touched by many people can hold too many explanations. A sample may be too small, too degraded, or too ambiguous. Chain of custody must be clear. The lab result must not only be interesting, it must be useful, reliable, and connected to the event in a way investigators can defend. You can feel the sober rhythm of that process. A submission form, a sealed packet, a lab technician's gloves, the soft click of a drawer, a report returned weeks or months later. Sometimes the result is nothing. Sometimes it is partial. Sometimes it excludes someone. Sometimes, after many years, it points toward a name. Even then, the detective does not leap. The detective verifies. Verification is a quiet word, but in cold cases it has great strength. It means checking the person's life, movements, access, history, vehicles, work, known locations, and possible ties to the victims. It means asking whether there are innocent explanations. It means seeing whether one result is supported by another. You sit with that because it is the opposite of rumor. It is the method by which grief is protected from false answers. The name Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. brought investigators back to water, boats, and the working edges of the Tidewater region. You can imagine old employment records, licenses, addresses, and remembered sightings being laid beside one another. The smell of river mud returns to the file. So does the sound of outboard motors in the distance, the roughness of dock rope, and the grey light of early morning over a landing. Geography, once background, becomes active again. Yet even a convincing geographic fit cannot solve every page. The absence of a link to Kathleen and Rebecca, or to Keith and Cassandra, matters. It tells us the file still has rooms where the lamp has not reached. You and I, sitting with the case tonight, have to let that remain true. We do not smooth it away for comfort. We let the uncertainty stay in its proper place, because that is what respect for the victims requires. The Colonial Parkway case also reminds us that cases are often named by outsiders. A newspaper phrase, a broadcast shorthand, or a community label can gather several events under one roof. That roof may be useful for memory, but investigators must still inspect the beams. Are the connections evidentiary, geographic, behavioral, or emotional? Are they strong, weak, circumstantial, or only apparent? A name can hold attention, but it cannot testify. As you turn the pages, you begin to notice the different kinds of silence. There is the silence of a missing witness who never came forward. There is the silence of evidence not yet testable. There is the silence of a suspect who has died. There is the silence of a family waiting for a phone call that never arrives. These silences are not empty. They are dense, like fog over the river before sunrise. A detective learns to work inside that fog. You move slowly. You do not pretend to see more than you see. You mark the edges of what is known, and you return when the light changes. This is why the Colonial Parkway case belongs so naturally to late-night reflection. It is not a story of fast pursuit. It is a story of people trying to keep faith with facts that arrived incomplete. One practical difficulty was the lack of modern surveillance. Today, many roads, stores, gas stations, tolls, and homes produce some kind of record. In the late 1980s, a person could move with far less trace. You had paper receipts, witnesses, maybe a call from a payphone, maybe a motel registration, maybe nothing at all. A car could pass through a county without becoming data. A person could be present and leave no electronic shadow. You can imagine detectives canvassing the old way. They stop at businesses, they ask clerks, they speak with attendants, neighbors, students, workers, and people who were simply nearby. They write down names and times, they collect impressions. The day smells of cigarette smoke in offices, gasoline at stations, and rain drying on jackets. Every answer has to be weighed, and every non-answer leaves space behind it. Another difficulty was the population of the region itself. Hampton Roads and the surrounding areas were not isolated. Military bases, shipyards, colleges, tourist sites, highways, and waterways brought constant movement. A person could know the area without being rooted there. A person could work near the water, drive the roads, leave for another state, and return months later. That mobility made suspect lists expand and contract like breathing. When a suspect pool becomes large, prioritization becomes its own art. You ask who had opportunity, who had access, who matched physical evidence, who appeared in more than one place, who had a history that mattered, and who was only a name produced by fear or coincidence. You can feel the detective's pencil moving down a list, adding checks, question marks, and small notes in the margin. It is patient sorting, nothing more glamorous than that. The Colonial Parkway case had the added pressure of public fear. Even when officials tried to be careful, people who had once driven the road for quiet now wondered about every parked car and every set of headlights. Couples avoided overlooks. Parents asked more questions. The landscape changed in the imagination before it changed in fact. Detectives had to investigate while the community watched, hoped, worried, and speculated. Speculation can be both a lantern and a glare. It may bring tips. It may keep names alive. It may also produce false patterns, false suspects, and confident stories built from very little. You can see why investigators speak cautiously in long cases. A careless phrase can harden into public belief. A rumor can follow an innocent person for years. A detail released too soon can damage the chance of knowing whether a future confession or tip is real. So parts of the file remained unreleased. That, too, can frustrate the public. But you understand it as you sit beside the lamp. Some details are held back because they are useful only if few people know them. Some are withheld out of respect. Some are withheld because they would not help anyone sleep easier or think more clearly. In patient detective work, silence can be a tool, not merely an absence. The case also lived through changing media. Early reports appeared in newspapers and on local broadcasts, with photographs, sketches, and interviews. Later came cable programs, forums, podcasts, and online timelines. Each generation retold the Colonial Parkway case in its own way, sometimes carefully, sometimes with more certainty than the file could support. You can imagine the old clippings, their edges yellowed, lying beside a modern printed web page. Both try to hold the same unanswered past. For detectives, public retellings can create work. A renewed program may prompt a genuine witness to call after many years. It may also bring a wave of theories based on incomplete information. Investigators have to sort through all of it. They listen for a detail that was never public, a name that appears in another file, a memory that fits a timeline without being forced. Most leads fade. A few remain. The long hunt for answers in the Colonial Parkway case was also shaped by the emotional difficulty of linkage analysis. To ask whether cases are connected is to compare human losses, and that must be done with care. You are not comparing stories for entertainment. You are comparing evidence to see whether one person, one method, one geography, or one opportunity might explain more than one event. The work is analytical, but it has to remain humane. You can picture investigators placing large maps on a wall, marking the Parkway, Ragged Island, Interstate 64, the York River Overlook, and other points that mattered. The pins may look close on a regional map, but each location has its own practical world. Travel time, visibility, road access, water access, nearby witnesses, A map gives the impression of simplicity until you begin to ask how a person actually moved through it. Movement is one of the quiet keys. How did someone arrive? How did someone leave? Was there a second vehicle? Was water involved? Was the location chosen in advance or found in the moment? Did the person know patrol habits or merely rely on the privacy of night? Each question opens another drawer. Sometimes the drawer is empty, sometimes it contains a scrap that might matter, but only if another scrap appears. This is why the case can feel, even now, like a table covered with puzzle pieces from more than one box. Some fit, some almost fit. Some are from the same picture, but the corners are missing. Others may not belong at all. The patient detective does not force them. You let the pieces remain separate until the edges truly meet. It is a harder discipline than certainty, and often a kinder one. When later forensic work identified Wilmer in connection with the Nobling and Edwards case and the Lauer and Phelps case, it offered one of those real edges. It did not come from mood or rumor. It came from evidence, from comparison, from science that had matured after the original investigators had done their first work. You can feel the old envelope and the modern machine in the same breath, as if decades had briefly touched hands. But because Wilmer had died in 2017, the investigative path could not move into interrogation or trial. Detectives could not ask him where he had been on other nights, whether he knew particular places, whether he had contact with other victims, or whether there were accomplices. They could investigate around him, through records and evidence, but the central voice was gone. That is one of the cruel practical limits of time. A deceased suspect can be identified, but not questioned. A name can be announced, but not cross-examined. A family can receive an answer, but not the full human accounting that a courtroom might have attempted. You sit with that because it shows how cold case success can still feel incomplete. The file may narrow, but it does not always close with the sound people imagined. For the unsolved portions, detectives still had to keep going. Kathleen and Rebecca's case remained under its own burden of evidence. Keith and Cassandra's disappearance remained open in the deepest sense, because finding them remained part of finding the truth. You can imagine those folders beside the newer Wilmer material, not forgotten, not solved by proximity, still asking for attention. The lamp on the desk does not choose one page and abandon the others. The Colonial Parkway case also asks us to think about preservation beyond physical evidence. Memories need preservation too. Families preserve them. Friends preserve them. Communities preserve the fact that these were lives, not symbols. As years pass, the public may remember the title more easily than the individuals, so the file must keep the names clear. Kathleen Thomas, Rebecca Dowski, David Nobling, Robin Edwards, Keith Cole, Cassandra Haley, Daniel Lauer, Anna Maria Phelps. Names slow the mind in a good way. They prevent the case from becoming only a pattern. Each name belongs to a person with a morning routine, a private worry, a favorite place to sit, a voice someone can still hear inwardly. You can feel the files soften when you remember that. Detective work is not only about catching. It is about restoring the specific person from beneath the weight of a case title. If we drift back to the Parkway itself, we find it still doing what it was built to do. It carries visitors past colonial sites, wooded stretches, water views, and quiet places where the road seems to belong more to memory than traffic. On a misty morning, the brick and stonework can look almost suspended in time. Tires make a low, even sound. Trees lean inward. The air smells of soil, leaf litter, and river wind. It is easy to understand why the contrast stayed with people. A road made for reflection became linked with unanswered loss. The peaceful landscape did not cause the mystery, but it shaped the way people remembered it. Detectives had to work against that atmosphere, because atmosphere can suggest meaning where there may only be circumstance. You and I can notice the mood, but the file has to ask for facts. Facts, in this case, often came in fragments. A vehicle seen near a pull-off, a remembered conversation, an abandoned car, a location near water, a later forensic result, a suspect's known occupation, a jurisdictional note, a lab report. Each fragment has edges, and those edges must be respected. The temptation is to narrate a smooth line through them, but the truth may be uneven. The file teaches you to tolerate unevenness. The reason detectives could never crack the whole Colonial Parkway case may lie partly in that unevenness. Some parts became clearer with time. Other parts remained resistant because the necessary evidence was absent, lost, never created, or not yet recognized. A witness who could have mattered may never have realized what they saw. A record that would help may never have existed. A trace may have been too faint from the beginning. Cold cases make us aware of how much ordinary life goes unrecorded. A late drive, a passing stranger, a car parked for 10 minutes, a person buying gas without drawing notice. In the moment, these things are nothing. Later, they may become everything. But by then, the receipt is gone, the clerk has changed jobs, the road has been repaved, and the memory has blended with other nights. Detectives work in the gap between importance and notice. You can feel that gap in the Colonial Parkway case again and again. It is there between the last known sighting and the next confirmed fact. It is there between one jurisdiction's report and another's. It is there between public belief and forensic proof. It is there between a partial answer and a full one. Sitting with the file, you learn that gaps are not empty spaces. They are places where work gathers. The work continues through re-examination. A cold case unit may assign fresh eyes, and fresh eyes can be useful because they are not attached to old assumptions. You can imagine a younger investigator reading a report written before they were born, noticing an abbreviation, pausing over a witness name and asking for the supporting file. The old detectives did not fail because something is noticed later. Sometimes the later reader simply has different tools, different databases, and a different angle of light. Fresh eyes, though, need old knowledge. The best cold case work combines both. It respects the investigators who stood at the scene, smelled the air, spoke to the first witnesses, and saw things before time altered them. It also invites new science, new comparisons, and new skepticism. You can picture two generations at the same table, one remembering the road as it was, the other searching a database that did not exist then. Both are needed. In the Colonial Parkway case, the balance between old and new has always mattered. Too much reliance on old theory can keep a case trapped. Too much faith in new technology can make people forget context. A DNA result is powerful, but it still must be placed within a human event. A witness statement is valuable, but it must be weighed against time. The patient detective holds both kinds of evidence gently but firmly. There is a kind of humility in that, and it may be why these old cases stay with us at night. They remind us that truth is not always available on demand. Sometimes it has to be protected before it can be discovered. Sometimes it waits in a sealed envelope for a method not yet invented. Sometimes it remains hidden because the world did not notice the right thing at the right time. The file does not scold us for that. It simply records the cost. As you continue through the Colonial Parkway pages, you may notice how often the investigation returns to ordinary materials. Cars, roads, keys, photographs, notes, maps, receipts, clothing, weather. The great mystery is built from humble objects. Their surfaces hold the patient pressure of attention. A detective bends over them and asks them to explain a night that no longer exists. Sometimes they answer. Often they do not. Even when they do not, the asking matters. It keeps the case from dissolving into rumor. It keeps the victims from becoming only a phrase. It keeps families connected to official effort, even when official effort has little new to say. You can imagine a detective making a call with no breakthrough to offer, only the honest statement that the file is still being reviewed. That may sound small, but in a long case, small honesty is part of care. The Colonial Parkway case has been revisited by task forces, journalists, family advocates, and independent researchers, each bringing a different kind of attention. Some attention helps, some complicates. The file must absorb it all without losing its shape. You can almost see the layers building over time. Original reports at the bottom, then supplements, lab updates, media inquiries, letters, review memos, and modern forensic notes. A cold case is an archive that keeps breathing. Archives have their own atmosphere. The boxes are quiet, but not inert. When you lift a lid, a faint paper smell rises, and the past becomes a little more present. You see names written in pen, typed statements with uneven letters, photocopies softened by age, and photographs whose colors have shifted. The room may be ordinary, but the act of opening the box is not. It is a promise to look again. Looking again is sometimes the most faithful thing anyone can do. Not inventing, not dramatizing, not forcing closure. Just looking again with better tools and a steady heart. The Colonial Parkway case required that kind of faithfulness because it resisted the easy satisfactions people often want from crime stories. It did not give one confession, one trial, one final explanation, or one neat line from beginning to end. Instead, it gave partial resolution, ongoing questions, and a warning about the limits of pattern. It showed that cases grouped together in public memory can separate under forensic scrutiny. It showed that evidence can wait longer than the people who left it behind. It showed that an answer can arrive too late for a courtroom and still matter deeply. You can hold all of that at once, if you keep the room quiet enough. The quiet matters. In a loud telling, the case becomes a set of dramatic beats. In the actual file, it is slower and more careful. A family member waits for a return call. A detective reads an old statement before bed. A lab worker checks a sample. A retired officer remembers a road at dusk. A name appears in a report. Another name remains absent. The rhythm is not thrilling. It is human. You and I remain at the desk, turning another page. Outside, in the imagined night, the air has cooled. The lamp gives off a small warmth. The pages lie flat, and the parkway runs through them like a dark ribbon under trees. We are not trying to solve it in one sitting. We are trying to understand why solving it was so hard and why patience became the only honest way forward. The next page brings us back to the idea of opportunity. Whoever approached any of these victims had to find a moment without interruption, a place with enough privacy, and a way to take control of an ordinary situation without immediately drawing notice. You can think of that not as a dramatic scene, but as an investigative problem. Where could that happen? Who would know such places? What kind of vehicle would pass without attention? What time would make the road quiet enough? Those questions led investigators into practical worlds. Police procedure, park patrols, fishing schedules, boat ramps, shift work, college social life, military routines, late-night driving habits. Each world had its own calendar and its own witnesses. You can feel the complexity spreading like ink moving through soft paper. The more possibilities detectives considered, the more work each possibility required. A person familiar with the waterways might move differently than someone tied only to the road. A person with authority might approach differently than someone relying on surprise. A local person might know which overlooks were secluded. A transient person might choose places by chance. Each theory explains something and leaves something else unanswered. The Colonial Parkway case endured partly because no theory covered every page with equal strength. This is where cold case work becomes almost meditative. You do not ask one question once. You ask it in different ways over years. You compare the answer against new facts. You let go of a theory when it stops fitting. You return to an old theory when new evidence gives it weight. The detective's mind must be firm enough to persist and flexible enough to change. That balance is rare, and it is tiring. You can imagine the tiredness in an office late in the evening. The overhead lights have been turned off, leaving only a desk lamp. A chair creaks, the file smells faintly of dust and toner. Someone rubs their eyes and reads the same witness statement again, not because they expect magic, but because sometimes the mind notices a small thing only after the larger things have become familiar. This is patient work, at its most ordinary. In the Colonial Parkway case, ordinary patience eventually met extraordinary delay. Decades passed between the first events and the later forensic identification tied to some of the victims. During those decades, the world changed around the case. Phones moved from walls to pockets. Maps moved from glove compartments to screens. DNA moved from emerging science to daily investigative practice. Yet the old road remained, and so did the need to answer what happened along and around it. The passage of time can make a case feel distant, But for families, it often stays near. A missing person does not become historical to the people who love them. A death without full answers does not settle simply because the calendar turns. You can feel that as you read names across decades. The public may rediscover the case in waves. Families never fully leave it. Detectives who understand that speak carefully. Careful speech is part of the Colonial Parkway story. Officials had to explain what they knew, what they believed, what they could prove, and what remained unresolved. Those distinctions can sound technical, but they protect truth. There is a difference between a suspect, a person of interest, an offender identified by evidence, and a name repeated by rumor. Each term carries weight. A patient investigation uses them deliberately. When Wilma's name entered the public record in connection with some of the long-associated cases, it changed the landscape of discussion. You can imagine people returning to old timelines, adjusting theories, asking whether earlier assumptions had been too broad or not broad enough. The case did not become simple. It became more precise. Precision can feel less satisfying than a sweeping answer, but it is closer to justice. Precision asks us to say that David Knobling, Robin Edwards, Daniel Lauer, and Anna Maria Phelps received a kind of answer through later evidence. It asks us to say that Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski still require their own answer. It asks us to say that Keith Call and Cassandra Haley remain missing and that their absence cannot be solved by association alone. These are careful sentences, and careful sentences are what the file deserves. You may notice how the room feels stiller when we say that. The hum of the lamp seems lower, the papers seem heavier. Not every mystery becomes smaller when a name is found. Some become more clearly divided. That division may be painful, but it also prevents a false closure from covering people who still need attention. In cold case work, an unfinished truth is better than a finished mistake. The Colonial Parkway case could never be cracked quickly because it was never only a question of who. It was also a question of which events belonged together, which evidence mattered most, which agencies held which pieces, which memories could be trusted, and which technologies had not yet arrived. You can see the case as a long corridor with several doors. Some have opened partway, some are still closed, some may have been mislabeled from the beginning. And so the detective returns to basics: names, dates, places, vehicles, weather, witnesses, evidence, movement, opportunity. The basics may sound plain, but they are the foundation beneath every difficult case. You can run your finger down a timeline and feel the structure of it. Each confirmed moment like a small nail holding the paper in place. Between those nails, the page lifts slightly. That is where uncertainty lives. Uncertainty does not mean nothing is known. It means what is known has edges. The Colonial Parkway case has many edges. It has the edge of the scenic road against the water, the edge of one jurisdiction against another, the edge of old evidence against new science, the edge of family memory against public mythology. As you sit with it, you learn not to fear those edges. You learn to trace them slowly. Tracing them brings us again to the earliest autumn night, not to relive it, but to understand the investigative conditions: the weather, the darkness, the traffic, the location of the car, the timing of reports, and the first responding officers all mattered. A first response sets the tone for everything that follows. What is noticed then may be preserved. What is missed then may never be recovered. That is true in every case, and especially true on an open road. The first responders in any such case carry a burden they may not fully understand in the moment. They arrive, assess, protect, call, document, and begin the process of turning a place into a scene. You can imagine the beam of a flashlight moving over pavement, the crunch of gravel under shoes, the cool air against a face, and the radio voice asking for clarification. The night is still the night, but it has become evidence. Later investigators depend on that early care. They read the notes, they study the photographs. They ask why something was moved, why something was left, who arrived first, who entered, who stood where. None of this is glamorous. It is the scaffolding of proof. If a case later becomes famous, the first plain observations become even more important, because fame adds noise. The original scene is the quietest version of the truth. The Colonial Parkway case accumulated noise as years passed. Theories spread about law enforcement impersonators, serial offenders, local suspects, travelers, and people tied to boats or waterways. Some theories were reasonable enough to check. Others wandered far beyond evidence. Detectives had to keep sorting, even when public conversation became confident. The file does not move faster because people are certain. It moves when evidence supports the next step. You can feel how much discipline that requires. A detective may have a strong instinct about someone and still lack proof. A family may feel sure a theory explains everything and still need evidence that can stand. A journalist may connect dots that investigators cannot officially connect. The patient path is not always emotionally satisfying, but it is necessary. Without it, the case becomes a story people tell each other rather than a truth they can establish. In a sleep video, we let that necessity settle. We do not rush toward the sharpest theory. We stay with the quieter lesson. The Colonial Parkway case was hard because real life left uneven traces, and because the people trying to follow those traces were bound by standards that protect everyone. Proof takes time. Sometimes proof takes longer than a lifetime. Sometimes it arrives for one family while another family keeps waiting. That unequal arrival of answers may be one of the saddest parts of the file. You can imagine one folder receiving a new lab report, while another receives only a note that testing was not possible, or not useful, or not conclusive. The same shelf holds both. The same cold case unit may work both. The same public title may cover both. Yet the outcomes diverge. Evidence is not fair in how it survives. Evidence can be fragile in ways that feel almost personal. Heat, moisture, handling, packaging, contamination, and time can all change what remains available. A small trace may be enough, or it may be just short of enough. A sample may produce a profile, or a partial profile, or none. You can picture the lab report arriving in an envelope, the detective opening it with steady hands, and the room holding its breath in the smallest possible way. When a result is inconclusive, the work does not end. It shifts. Investigators may look for other items, other witnesses, other databases, other methods. They may wait for the next advance. Cold case work often depends on the humility to say, not yet, not never, not solved, not forgotten, just not yet. That phrase belongs quietly beside the Colonial Parkway case, especially in the pages still unresolved. As the night deepens around our imaginary desk, the parkway in your mind becomes less a road and more a question stretched through trees. You can see the white lines, the low shoulders, the turn-offs, the historical markers, and the way headlights curve briefly across trunks before disappearing. Somewhere beyond the road, water holds the dim reflection of sky. It is a peaceful image, and the case does not erase that peace. It complicates it. Places can carry more than one truth. The Colonial Parkway can be beautiful, historic, calm, and also connected to painful memory. Families can cherish a region and still wish it had yielded answers sooner. Detectives can admire a landscape and still study it for access points, blind spots, and secluded pull-offs. You and I can hold those truths together without making the place into something monstrous. The road is a road. The questions are human. Human questions often remain because humans are fallible. Witnesses forget. Investigators make judgment calls with limited information. Agencies communicate imperfectly. Technology arrives late. Suspects move, die, or hide inside ordinary lives. None of that requires a grand explanation. It is enough to make a case last decades. The Colonial Parkway case is, in many ways, a study in how many ordinary limits can gather around extraordinary grief. The study continues when you examine the role of vehicles. In each associated case, a vehicle mattered in some way, whether as a place found, a place abandoned, or a clue to movement. Cars are intimate spaces, but also public objects. They hold fingerprints, fibers, maps, wrappers, receipts, and the faint smell of the people who used them. They also sit in lots, overlooks, shoulders, and rest areas where strangers can pass close without thinking. A vehicle can mislead by seeming more informative than it is. You may know where it was found, but not who drove it there. You may know when someone likely used it, but not who approached it later. You may find a print that belongs to a friend, a mechanic, an officer, or a stranger. Every detail requires context. You can feel detectives resisting the temptation to make a parked car say more than it can. The Colonial Parkway case also required investigators to think about offender behavior without turning behavior into certainty. Some offenders repeat patterns. Some change them. Some choose places for practical reasons rather than symbolic ones. Some appear organized because the scene was simple, not because the person planned deeply. Behavioral analysis can guide questions, but it cannot replace evidence. The patient detective uses it as a map sketch, not as a verdict. This matters because the public often remembers patterns more than proof. Young couples, isolated places, vehicles, water, roads near the peninsula. Those elements are real enough to notice, yet each must be weighted carefully. You can place them on the table like smooth stones gathered from different shores. They resemble one another, but resemblance alone does not tell you whether they came from the same hand. The later connection to Wilma gave some of those stones a shared origin. It did not give all of them one. That is the careful middle ground where the case now rests. You can feel how unsatisfying and honest it is. It asks for patience from everyone who wants finality. It asks us to keep separate what evidence keeps separate. It asks us to remember that a famous case title can be both useful and imprecise. And beneath all of this is the simple passage of years. The late 1980s recede into a softer, grainier world of paper maps, payphones, cassette answering machines, and handwritten address books. You can hear the click of a rotary office phone somewhere, the clatter of keys on a typewriter, the low buzz of fluorescent light. Detectives worked inside that world, and every limitation of that world entered the case with them. Today, we may look back and wonder why there was no camera, no immediate database hit, no cell tower record, no digital trail. But that is looking backward with tools the original investigators did not have. The fairer question is what they preserved, what they asked, and how later investigators used what remained. In parts of the Colonial Parkway case, that preservation eventually mattered. In other parts, the missing pieces remain missing. Missing pieces have their own gravity. They draw attention again and again. What happened after Keith and Cassandra's car was left at the York River Overlook? Who approached Kathleen and Rebecca near the parkway? Whether any witness saw something they never understood? Whether an old private memory still sits in someone's mind, unreported because it seems too small? Cold cases often turn on small things that once looked too ordinary to mention. You can imagine someone years later remembering a truck, a uniform-like jacket, a boat name, a marina conversation, or a person who knew the parkway too well. Perhaps they dismissed it. Perhaps they called and it led nowhere. Perhaps the memory changed. Detectives have to leave room for the possibility without depending on it. They wait, but waiting is active. The phone line remains part of the file. As we continue through these pages, the night around us stays calm. The lamp glows. The paper rests. The Colonial Parkway runs quietly through Virginia, as it always has. And the old case follows it in thought, from pull-off to riverbank to rest area to archive shelf. You are not being pulled toward a final answer. You are being invited to understand the long shape of not having one and the steady hands of those who kept looking anyway. The next page has the quiet feel of a map unfolded too many times, its creases whitening where the paper has grown tired. You can smooth it with your palm and see the waterways spread out again. The York, the James, the smaller roads, the quiet turnoffs, and the long green line of the Colonial Parkway itself. A map like this can make a case look orderly, but you know by now that order on paper is not the same as order in life. Roads cross, jurisdictions overlap, people move through places for reasons no file can fully know. When detectives looked at the Colonial Parkway case over the years, they had to treat geography almost like another witness. It could tell them distances, access points, likely routes, and where a person might go if they knew the area well. But geography could not tell them motive, certainty, or whether two similar events truly shared one source. You can imagine an investigator leaning close to the map, smelling coffee and old paper, tracing a route with a capped pen while rain taps faintly against the window. The road is clear under the plastic overlay. The answer is not. The Tidewater region does not behave like a simple grid. It has rivers that interrupt a straight path, bridges that change travel time, military installations, historic roads, tourist routes, and small practical roads known mostly to locals. You may think a place is close until the water forces you around. You may think a location is remote until you remember the fisherman, the worker, the student, or the patrol officer who might pass at an odd hour. Detectives had to think in those practical terms. They had to ask not only where, but how. How would someone move from one place to another without drawing attention? How would they know which overlook was quiet? How would they handle a car, a witness, a changing patrol pattern, or the simple risk of another driver appearing around a bend? The Colonial Parkway case invited these questions because so many details gathered around vehicles and roads, yet the answers were often soft at the edges. You can hear the hush of tires over damp pavement as you sit with that. You can see headlights sliding over tree trunks, then gone. The parkway's very design worked against easy reconstruction. It was meant for scenery, not surveillance. Pull-offs were places for looking outward, not places covered by cameras or watched by clerks behind counters. At night, a parked car could be romantic, ordinary, lost, tired, or suspicious, depending on who looked and when. If someone saw it for only a moment, the mind might file it away as nothing. Later, when the news came, that same moment might return with too much importance or too little detail. Witness memory became one of the delicate instruments in the case. You hold it carefully, because memory is not a machine. It is more like a pond that takes the shape of weather. A person may remember a color but not a model. A person may remember a time because of a television program, a work shift, or a meal, then later discover they were off by an hour. Detectives knew this, and you can feel them trying to be fair. They needed witnesses, but they also needed to protect the case from certainty that had not been earned. In old reports, a witness statement often has a gentle plainness to it. Someone was driving home, someone noticed a vehicle, someone thought a person looked official, someone saw lights near an overlook. The words may be typed neatly, but the reality behind them is dim and moving. You can imagine the witness sitting at a kitchen table, the smell of dish soap and evening coffee in the room, trying to pull one night back from many. The detective waits, pen still, letting the memory arrive if it can. That waiting is part of the craft. A rushed question can shape an answer, a leading word can plant a detail, a tired witness can agree just to be done. Patient detectives learn to leave space, and in the Colonial Parkway case, space was everywhere. Space between sightings, space between agencies, space between one pair of victims and another, space between public belief and private evidence. The file is full of gaps, and yet the gaps are not failures by themselves. They are the territory. As you turn another page, the scent of the archive seems to deepen. Paper, dust, cardboard, and the faint metallic smell of old filing cabinets create a room that feels outside ordinary time. You may notice how the case changes in that room. It stops being a headline and becomes labor. A folder comes out. A notation is checked. A call is made to another agency. A lab request is reviewed. A retired investigator is contacted for context. The work is quiet enough that someone passing in the hall might not know anything important is happening. This is why cold casework can be misunderstood. The public sees silence and imagines inaction. Inside the file, silence may mean testing, comparison, legal review, family notification, or the slow process of confirming whether a new lead is real. The Colonial Parkway case spent many years in that kind of silence. Not empty silence. Working silence. The kind where a person reads carefully before speaking, because words, once spoken in a case like this, can settle heavily on living people. There were many living people around the case. Families, friends, former classmates, co-workers, officers, witnesses, and people whose names appeared once in a report and never again. Each deserved care. A person can be questioned without being guilty. A rumor can attach itself to a name and cause damage long after investigators have moved on. You can feel the ethical weight of that when you read suspect notes in an old case. The detective's job is not just to pursue, it is to distinguish. Distinguishing became especially important once the Colonial Parkway case became widely known. A known case attracts theories the way a lamp attracts dust in still air. Some theories are grounded in evidence, some are built from coincidence, fear, or the desire for a complete pattern. Detectives had to read them all without surrendering to them. You can imagine a bulletin board growing crowded with names and arrows, then a careful investigator removing the arrows that looked stronger than they were. The case's public identity made linkage both necessary and dangerous. Necessary because ignoring possible connections would have been irresponsible. Dangerous because connection can become a story before it becomes proof. When young pairs vanish or are found along roads and waterways within a few years, the mind naturally reaches towards a single explanation. Yet each pair had its own circumstances, and each circumstance had to stand on its own. You return to that principle like a handrail in a dim stairwell. The deaths of David Knobling and Robin Edwards, later attributed by investigators to Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., had a geography tied to water and shore. The deaths of Daniel Lauer and Anna Maria Phelps, also later connected to Wilmer by evidence, brought in another set of roads, travel, and discovery. Those connections mattered deeply. They show how old evidence can speak at last, but they do not automatically answer the Colonial Parkway murders of Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski, or the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley. The handrail matters because the staircase turns. You can imagine investigators, after the Wilmer announcement, returning to the remaining files with fresh intensity. A name had emerged. A known life could be examined. Did he have contact with the Parkway? Did he know the York River overlook? Did he have opportunities matching those earlier nights? Did any evidence from Kathleen and Rebecca's case, or Keith and Cassandra's case, speak his name in the same way? These are careful questions, and the file does not allow them to be answered merely because people wish it. A deceased suspect creates a peculiar investigative atmosphere. Records can still be searched, movements can be reconstructed where documents survive, but the central person cannot be placed in a chair under soft fluorescent light and asked to account for a missing evening. You can hear the absence of that interview. No cough, no shifting feet, no denial, no pause before an answer. Just paperwork, evidence, memory, and silence. That silence leaves detectives with indirect routes. They may look at property records, employment records, boat ownership, vehicle history, criminal history, acquaintances, locations, and patterns of movement. They may ask people what they remember of a man who is no longer alive. But memories of a dead person can be complicated. Some soften, some harden, some become shaped by what the news has said. The investigator must listen with sympathy and caution in equal measure. In the Colonial Parkway case, sympathy and caution are not opposites. They belong together. Sympathy keeps the victims and families at the center. Caution keeps the answers honest. Without sympathy, a case becomes an exercise. Without caution, it becomes rumor. You and I, sitting with the papers tonight, keep both on the desk beside us, like two small weights holding down the corners of a map. The files also hold the slow evolution of forensic thinking. In the late 1980s, investigators knew physical evidence mattered, but the future range of DNA analysis could not be fully imagined. A trace too small to test then might become meaningful later. An item once considered marginal might be preserved and re-examined decades afterward. You can picture evidence envelopes stored in boxes, the seals aging, the ink fading slightly, while science outside the room keeps advancing step by step. That advancement was not magic. It came through technicians, researchers, database builders, policy changes, funding, court decisions, and years of ordinary laboratory work. Each improvement widened what detectives could ask of the past. The Colonial Parkway case benefited from that wider language in some places, but not everywhere. Evidence is uneven. Some items survive in useful condition. Some do not. Some scenes yield biological material. Some scenes offer little beyond placement and absence. There is a quiet sadness in that unevenness. One family may receive a result because a sample survived. Another may hear that there is nothing comparable to test. One case may be strengthened by a stored item. Another may depend on a witness who has died. The file does not distribute hope evenly, it simply contains what time allowed to remain. Detectives have to work with that, even when it feels unfair. You can feel the age of the case in small administrative details. Phone numbers with old area codes, addresses that no longer belong to the same people, agencies reorganized, officers promoted, retired, or gone, storage systems changed, computer databases replacing paper indexes. A file that began in one era must be translated into another, and translation can create its own work. Someone must scan, catalog, cross reference, and check that nothing important is lost in the transfer. The physical act of transferring an old case into a modern system is itself a kind of investigation. You lift each report, you verify dates, you identify duplicates, you read handwriting, you decide how to label a photograph. You attach metadata so a future search can find what an old detective once knew by memory. The work smells of warm scanner glass, toner, and cardboard. It is not exciting, but it can change what is findable. Findability matters because a case spread across agencies and decades can hide its own connections. A name misspelled in one report may not appear in a search. A nickname may not link to a legal name. A vehicle description may sit in a supplemental file no one has opened in years. You can imagine a detective discovering that one small note, not new at all, has become newly useful because it can now be compared against a broader field. The past has not changed. The access has. The Colonial Parkway case needed that kind of access because its questions crossed so many boundaries. Federal investigators, state police, local departments, park authorities, labs, medical offices, and families each held pieces of context. In a perfect world, every piece would align instantly. In the real world, people call, request, wait, resend, clarify, and sometimes discover that a box is stored in a different building than anyone thought. The work is procedural, and procedure takes time. Procedure can sound cold, but it protects meaning. A lab submission must be documented. A piece of evidence must be accounted for. A new statement must be recorded accurately. A family notification must be handled before a public announcement. In the Colonial Parkway case, where rumor had lived for decades, procedure was a way of keeping the truth from being swept up in excitement. You can feel the steadying value of paperwork when the stakes are high. As the file moves through years, you may notice another reason the case resisted closure. The victims were young, and young lives have wide social circles. Friends from school, work, military communities, neighborhoods, parties, and families all had to be understood. Most people in those circles were simply grieving, frightened, or confused. But investigators still had to ask difficult questions. Who saw whom? Who knew the plans? Who might have had access? Who changed their story? Who vanished from view? The social world of the victims was not a list. It was a living network. People talked to one another. Rumors traveled. Memories influenced memories. Someone might repeat something they heard from a friend and later remember it as personal knowledge. Detectives had to separate first-hand observation from community echo. You can hear the soft scrape of a pencil marking one statement as direct and another as second-hand. Small distinctions like that can matter. In older cases, those distinctions become harder to recover. A person who was 20 in 1988 is much older now. They may have moved several times, changed names, lost touch, or forgotten the exact sequence of events. They may remember emotion better than timing. They may remember the shock of hearing the news, but not the conversation from the night before. You sit with that patiently because memory is doing its best, even when it cannot do enough. The Colonial Parkway case also carried the challenge of ordinary privacy. Young adults do not always tell families every plan. Friends do not always know where someone went after leaving a gathering. Couples may choose a quiet place for reasons that are private and harmless. A route may change for no meaningful reason. Investigators must be careful not to turn every unknown into suspicion. Sometimes a missing detail is simply part of normal life. Normal life leaves soft edges. A borrowed car, a casual invitation, a change in plans, a stop for fuel, a decision to take the scenic route, a conversation no one else hears. These soft edges are where cold cases often begin. Later, detectives try to harden them into a timeline, but some remain soft forever. The Colonial Parkway case has many such edges, and each one slowed the work. You can imagine a timeline written across a long sheet of paper, with confirmed moments in dark ink and possible moments in lighter notes. A last sighting, a reported time, a found vehicle, a phone call, a search. The confirmed points give structure, but the spaces between them hold the uncertainty that detectives needed to cross. Every bridge across those spaces required evidence, not just desire. Desire for answers is powerful, and families had every right to it. Communities had it too. Detectives had it, though they often expressed it less openly. But desire cannot substitute for proof. That is one of the hardest truths in the case. The people closest to the victims deserved answers, yet the only answers worthy of them had to be true. You can feel how heavy that standard is when years have passed and the file is still open. The Colonial Parkway case is sometimes discussed as though one brilliant insight should have solved it. Sitting with the file, you see instead a tangle of practical limits. No universal camera coverage, limited forensic tools, fragmented jurisdictions, aging witnesses, possible offender mobility, the uncertainty of linkage, evidence that survived unevenly, a suspect later identified for some cases after his death. These are not excuses. They are the terrain detectives had to walk. Terrain matters. On paper, terrain is a word. In life, it is mud on shoes, darkness under trees, a riverbank that looks different at high tide, and a road shoulder where a car can sit partly hidden by foliage. The region around the parkway has many such textures. Marsh grass bends, gravel shifts, wood absorbs moisture, fog lowers itself over water. A detective studying these places must know that a map is only the beginning of the physical truth. Searches, when they happened, would have been shaped by that physical truth. Woods, shorelines, fields, ditches, and water require different methods. You can imagine searchers moving slowly, boots damp, radios quiet, the air smelling of wet leaves and brackish water. Search work is patient and exhausting. It often produces nothing. Yet nothing is still a result in the record, a place checked, a possibility narrowed, a note added for the future. For Keith Cole and Cassandra Haley, searches and inquiries had to contend with the deepest kind of uncertainty. Without recovered remains, the case remained open not only legally, but physically. The file could not place a final point on the map. Families could not gather around a complete answer. Detectives could revisit the overlook, the route, the people around them, and any later tip. But the central absence remained. You can feel that absence like a cool draft under a closed door. Absence shapes investigation differently from evidence. It expands the possible area. It extends the timeline. It leaves room for sightings, hopes, false leads, and painful calls. Someone thinks they saw one of the missing. Someone reports a rumor. Someone dreams of a location and mistakes the feeling for knowledge. Detectives must respond without being swept away. Compassion requires listening. Discipline requires verification. Verification often returns to records, and records age in their own ways. A hotel ledger may be gone. A vehicle registration may be archived. A workplace schedule may have been discarded decades earlier. A marina log may never have existed. You can picture an investigator calling a business only to learn it closed long ago. The building now something else, the old owner unreachable. Time removes not only people but the ordinary documents that once surrounded them. Even so, old records sometimes survive unexpectedly. A retired worker keeps a box. A courthouse file is stored off-site. A photograph in a family album shows a vehicle in the background. A newspaper archive preserves a small notice that helps fix a date. Cold case detectives learn to be open to modest surprises. You never know which dull-looking page will become useful when placed beside another dull-looking page. The work rewards patience more often than brilliance. The Colonial Parkway case also shows how offender identification can depend on cases outside the famous title. When investigators tied Wilma to some of the long-associated victims, they were not simply solving a branded mystery. They were following evidence where it led, through specific cases and specific items. That matters because evidence may not respect public categories. It may cut across them, strengthen some connections, and weaken others. You have to let it. Letting evidence lead can require surrendering a theory you have lived with for years. You can imagine an investigator who long believed all four pairs were connected, sitting quietly after a new result and adjusting that belief. Or another who doubted connection, now forced to accept that some events did share a source. Both adjustments require humility. The file does not care what anyone predicted. It only asks what can be supported. Humility is a recurring sound in this case, soft as pages turning. It is there when a detective says, "We do not know." It is there when an agency reopens evidence collected by someone else long ago. It is there when a family accepts a partial answer without pretending it heals everything. It is there when the public learns to say some parts are solved and others are not. In a long case, humility is not weakness, it is accuracy. Accuracy extends even to language. The phrase Colonial Parkway murders is familiar, but it can blur the distinctions among incidents. Some occurred directly connected to the parkway. Some occurred elsewhere but were grouped because of timing, geography, or perceived pattern. Some victims were found, some remain missing. Some cases have forensic attribution, others do not. You can feel why a careful narrator keeps returning to names and specifics, so the title does not swallow the people inside it. The title still has value. It keeps memory alive. It gives people a way to search, discuss, and remember a cluster of painful events. But the title is not the same as the evidence. Sitting beside the lamp, you can hold the title in one hand and the separate folders in the other. That balance may be the only honest way to speak of the case. One public name, several human stories, uneven answers. The deeper you read, the more the case becomes a lesson in time. Time helped by allowing science to advance, time harmed by taking witnesses, records, suspects, and sharp memories. Time allowed families to become advocates. Time also forced them to live decades with absence. Time turned investigators into retirees and young victims into permanent photographs. It gave and took in the same slow motion. You can hear that motion in the imagined archive. The building settles, a clock ticks somewhere beyond the room. A page slides from one folder to another. Outside, traffic passes in a low ribbon of sound, not unlike the parkway at night. The calm is not emptiness. It is the setting in which long attention can survive. This is the atmosphere cold cases require, because quick emotion burns too hot and fades. Long attention asks you to return without demanding reward. A detective may spend a week checking a lead that ends in nothing. A family member may call with a question and hear that there is no update. A lab may test an item and produce no usable profile. The work continues anyway. In the Colonial Parkway case, that continuation is one of the quietest forms of respect. It says the absence of an answer is not the end of responsibility. Responsibility also means being honest about false certainty. Over the years, people have proposed many names, motives, and patterns. Some may have seemed compelling in isolation. A suspect with access to a road. A person with a badge. Someone with a boat. Someone who lived nearby. Someone who left the area. Each possibility had to be examined, but a possibility does not become truth by fitting a mood. You can feel the file resisting that kind of shortcut. The mood of the case is powerful, though. A scenic colonial road. Young people. Parked cars. Rivers. Decades of waiting. The elements almost arrange themselves into folklore if you let them. But detectives cannot solve folklore. They solve events, with dates, bodies, evidence, witnesses, locations, and standards of proof. You and I may sense the atmosphere, but we keep our hands on the paper. The paper is what keeps us honest. Paper shows the work in layers. Initial reports, supplemental interviews, lab submissions, evidence inventories, search notes, tip sheets, press releases, family communications, review memos. Each layer was written because someone did one more task. You can imagine the file growing not through drama, but through accumulation. A cold case is an accumulation of care, even when care does not quickly become an answer. Sometimes the care is as simple as preserving an item no one yet knows how to read. That may be the most patient act in detective work. To keep something because it might matter later. To label it clearly for someone you will never meet. To trust that future methods may honor present caution. In the Colonial Parkway case, preservation helped bring some truth forward. It may still hold possibilities for the pages not fully answered. Those possibilities must be spoken of gently, not as promises, not as hooks. Just as open space, technology continues to develop. Records continue to be digitized. People continue to age into moments when they may choose to speak. A small detail can still matter, but it must arrive with enough substance to be tested. Hope in a cold case has to be steady, not loud. It has to leave room for disappointment and still remain. The families know that better than anyone. They have heard hopes before. They have seen anniversaries bring attention, then quiet. They have watched public interest rise and fall, while their own connection stayed constant. You can imagine them keeping a photograph on a shelf, or a clipping in a drawer, or a memory that does not need an object at all. Their patience is not passive, it is a form of witness. Witness, in this sense, means refusing to let a person become only what happened to them. Kathleen and Rebecca were more than the first known names tied to the Parkway. David and Robin were more than a later forensic attribution. Keith and Cassandra are more than a disappearance. Daniel and Anna Maria are more than a connection established after many years. Each life was full before the file began. The file can only gesture toward that fullness. Detectives know this limitation, even if they do not always say it. A report can record height, age, clothing, vehicle, last known location, and relationships. It cannot record the whole feel of a person in a room. It cannot fully preserve humor, warmth, habits, or dreams. That is why family voices matter. They restore the human scale of the case, and they remind investigators that every technical step has a person behind it. As you sit with the Colonial Parkway case tonight, your role as the quiet detective is not to rush toward blame, but to stay with scale. The scale of a road, the scale of a region, the scale of a family's waiting, the scale of an evidence envelope small enough to hold in one hand, the scale of decades. These scales do not match neatly, and the mismatch is part of the reason the case has felt so hard to hold. A small trace can change a large story. A large theory can collapse under a small inconsistency. A decades-long public belief can be refined by one lab result. A family's private grief can outlast every public cycle of attention. The Colonial Parkway case lives in those contrasts. It asks you to keep moving slowly enough that none of them blur. The next section of the file feels practical again, almost deliberately plain. It concerns interviews, canvases, and the long search for people who might have seen something. You can imagine detectives knocking on doors in neighborhoods near routes of travel, visiting workplaces, speaking with park staff, asking about vehicles, uniforms, boats, odd comments, and absences from work. The sounds are ordinary. A doorbell, a porch board creaking, a dog barking somewhere inside, a pen clicking open. Canvassing is one of the least glamorous and most necessary parts of investigation. Most conversations will not matter. Some people will be irritated. Some will be eager to help, but remember little. Some will tell stories that lead nowhere. Yet, one person may offer a time, a vehicle, a name, or a contradiction. Detectives cannot know which door matters before they knock. So they knock. The patience is physical. In a region with water, canvassing can include docks, marinas, boatyards, fishing communities, and people whose work begins before sunrise. Those conversations have their own atmosphere. Diesel smell, wet rope, coffee in a thermos, gulls calling over pilings, a worker wiping hands on a rag before looking at a photograph. These are the quiet edges where a person like Wilmer, later identified in some cases, might have moved without seeming out of place. But again, moving without seeming out of place is not proof by itself. Many innocent people knew the rivers. Many drove the roads. Many worked odd hours. Many had boats, trucks, or reasons to be near secluded places. The file must distinguish between familiarity and guilt. It must ask what evidence places a person within a crime, not merely within a landscape. That distinction may be frustrating, but it is essential. The Colonial Parkway case, for all its atmosphere, required investigators to stay with essentials. Was there physical evidence? Was there a witness? Was there an admission? Was there opportunity supported by records? Was there a link between cases beyond resemblance? Was the evidence strong enough to withstand challenge? These questions are plain, and their plainness is a kind of mercy. They keep the investigation from drifting into myth. Myth would be easy here. A dark road, a false authority, a shadow near the river, a pattern no one could break. But myth does not help families. It may keep attention alive, but it can also hide the harder, more useful work. The useful work is slower, checking evidence, preserving distinctions, correcting errors, and saying only what can be said. You can feel the calm strength of that as the file rests open in front of you. Errors, when they occur in public memory, can take years to correct. A date repeated incorrectly, a location simplified, a relationship misstated, a suspect described too confidently. Once those errors enter retellings, they travel. Detectives and family advocates often spend energy simply returning the case to its proper facts. That kind of correction may seem small, but it matters. A case built from wrong details cannot lead anyone home. So we return to proper facts with care. The Colonial Parkway case began with Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski in 1986, along the parkway that gave the broader case its name. It later came to include public discussion of David Knobling and Robin Edwards in 1987, Keith Call and Cassandra Haley in 1988, and Daniel Lauer and Anna Maria Phelps in 1989. Later evidence identified Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. in connection with the Knobling and Edwards case and the Lauer and Phelps case. Other parts remain unresolved. Stated plainly, that sequence does not sound like folklore. It sounds like work. Dates, names, places, evidence, distinctions. You can breathe more easily inside plainness. It does not remove grief, but it reduces confusion. For a detective, and for anyone trying to understand the case honestly, plain facts are the quiet floor beneath the room. Without them, everything tilts. The floor, however, still has cracks. Kathleen and Rebecca's case remains unanswered in the formal sense. Keith and Cassandra remain missing. Questions continue about whether Wilmer may be connected to more, whether someone else was responsible for the unsolved portions, whether more than one offender operated in the same broad region, or whether public grouping created an appearance of unity stronger than the evidence allows. The file does not yet close those cracks. You can sit beside those cracks without trying to fill them too quickly. The lamp hums softly. The page edges cast small shadows. The air in the room is cool enough that your hands notice it. This is the posture the case asks from us. Not fear, not certainty. Attention. The kind that can return to a difficult page and read it again without demanding that it become simpler than it is. Attention may eventually find meaning in something overlooked, but it may also simply preserve accuracy until another generation can look. That is not a small thing. Many cold cases have been harmed by lost evidence, careless storage, vanished records, or narratives that outran fact. The Colonial Parkway case endured partly because enough people kept returning to it, even when the returns were slow. The file remained alive because hands kept lifting it. The idea of a living file is strange but useful. A living file changes when new evidence is added, when old evidence is reinterpreted, when a witness calls, when a suspect is excluded, when a family provides context, when technology changes what can be tested. It is not alive in a dramatic sense. It is alive because responsibility continues. You can feel that in the weight of the folders, in the way one page leads to another. For detectives, continuing responsibility may mean accepting that they will not be the ones to finish the work. An investigator may contribute a careful interview, a preserved sample, a corrected timeline, or a narrowed suspect list, and then retire before the answer comes. That contribution still matters. Cold case work is often relay work, with one pair of hands passing the file to another. You can imagine the exchange, quiet and practical, under office lights. The relay in the Colonial Parkway case has lasted decades. Each generation brought its own tools. The early investigators brought direct scene knowledge and first witness contact. Later investigators brought databases, renewed forensic testing, broader interagency searches, and fresh review. Family advocates brought memory and pressure. Journalists brought attention. Each role had limits, but together they kept the case from disappearing into storage. The file moved because many people carried it a little farther. Still, carrying is not the same as solving. That distinction is important. A person can work faithfully and still not reach the final answer. A detective can do everything available at the time and still be stopped by missing evidence. A lab can test what remains and still produce no result. A case can be cared for and remain open. The Colonial Parkway case teaches that care and closure do not always arrive together. The teaching is quiet enough for night. It does not ask you to stay alert with sharp questions. It asks you to notice the slow human labor around uncertainty. The investigator who does not throw away a weak lead too early. The family member who corrects a name. The archivist who preserves a box. The lab worker who tries again with a better method. The retired officer who answers a call about a detail from long ago. Each is part of the same patient circle. The circle returns now to the road. The Colonial Parkway at night may be empty for long minutes, then briefly bright as a car passes. The trees take the light and release it. Water sits nearby, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden behind dark brush. The air smells of damp stone, river silt, pine, and leaves. You can imagine pulling into an overlook and hearing the engine tick as it cools. Ordinary sounds, ordinary sensations, made heavier by what the file knows. Detectives had to separate that heaviness from evidence. A place can feel significant because a terrible event became attached to it. But feeling is not chronology, and atmosphere is not witness testimony. The Parkway may seem to whisper in memory, but investigators needed it to speak in measurable details. Tire marks, times, locations, sightings, physical traces. Without those, the road remains a setting, not a solution. That may be one reason the case has held attention for so long. Settings are easier to imagine than evidence. People can picture the road, the river, the parked cars, the darkness, and the long years. They may not picture the months spent checking alibis, the careful wording of warrants, the laboratory limitations, or the slow review of chain of custody. The visible story is haunting. The real work is quieter, denser, and less easy to dramatize. We stay with the real work because it honors the case better. You can imagine an evidence technician laying items out under clean light, each one labeled and photographed. You can imagine a detective comparing old statements with a ruler and notepad. You can imagine someone requesting records from another state, then waiting weeks. You can imagine a family liaison choosing words before making a call. None of these scenes raises the pulse. They lower it into seriousness. Seriousness is the right register for the Colonial Parkway case. The victims deserve seriousness. The families deserve seriousness. Even the uncertainty deserves seriousness, because careless certainty can become another injury. When a case has lasted this long, every statement should pass through a quiet filter. Is it known? Is it believed? Is it possible? Is it proven? Which folder supports it? Which folder does not? You can use those questions as you read. They slow you down in a useful way. A sentence that once seemed clear may become conditional. A theory that seemed complete may develop a loose thread. This is not confusion. This is clarity becoming more precise. The file is teaching you to see in smaller units. Smaller units can be calming, even in a difficult case. One date, one road, one car, one witness, one lab result, one unanswered question. The mind can rest on each piece without forcing the whole. That is how detectives survive complex work, and it is how we move through the case tonight. The whole Colonial Parkway story is too large to hold all at once. So you hold one page, and then another. On one page, a car is found. On another, a family waits. On another, a name is compared. On another, the lab has no answer yet. The rhythm is slow, but it is not empty. It is the rhythm of patient inquiry. You can almost hear it in the paper, the soft lift and settle of each sheet as the file moves under your hand. The old question of why detectives could never crack the case begins to change as you sit with it. It no longer sounds like an accusation. It sounds like an invitation to understand limits. Detectives could not crack what the evidence could not yet support. They could not merge what science did not link. They could not question the dead. They could not recover vanished records. They could not make witnesses remember more than memory allowed. They could only keep working. Keeping working is not small. It brought later answers for some victims. It kept unresolved names in active memory. It preserved evidence long enough for new testing. It maintained distinctions that matter. It allowed the case to be corrected as new facts emerged. You can feel the dignity in that, quiet as dust in lamplight. The work did not give everyone everything, but it did not simply stop. As the night moves on, you may imagine the parkway in early morning now, not midnight. Mist gathers low over the river. The stone bridges look damp and pale. Birds begin before traffic does. A maintenance vehicle passes slowly. The road seems ordinary again, as roads must. People will drive it for history, for work, for errands, for the simple pleasure of a green corridor between places. The case remains, but life continues around it. That continuation can feel strange, yet it is part of every old case. Places return to use. Offices change staff. News cycles move on. Families age. Investigators take other assignments. But somewhere, a file remains labeled and reachable. Somewhere a name remains in a database. Somewhere an item remains sealed. The public surface may grow quiet, but the possibility of return stays present. Return is the word that keeps fitting. Detectives return to scenes. Families return to memories. Journalists return to anniversaries. Labs return to evidence. We return now to the simple fact that the Colonial Parkway case was never defeated by one obstacle. It was slowed by many. Each obstacle was ordinary enough on its own. Together they formed a long wall. One brick was jurisdiction, another was technology, another was geography, another was linkage uncertainty, another was public mythology, another was the death of a later identified suspect, another was the absence of recovered remains in one central disappearance. You can see the wall, but you can also see the hands that kept testing it, brick by brick, looking for any place the mortar had loosened. There is no need to make that image dramatic. It is only a way to understand persistence. The detective does not throw themselves against the wall. They inspect it. They measure it. They come back with better tools. They ask someone else to look. They wait for weather, for science, for a record, for a voice. The work is slow enough to be almost invisible, until one day a brick moves. In some parts of the Colonial Parkway case, a brick did move. In others, the wall remains. That unevenness is the present shape of the file. You can let it be uneven. The need for neatness belongs more to storytelling than to investigation. Real cases often end in partial light, with one section illuminated and another still grey. The quiet detective learns to be grateful for the light without pretending it reaches farther than it does. The grey sections still call for care. Kathleen and Rebecca's case asks for evidence strong enough to stand on its own. Keith and Cassandra's case asks for location, recovery, and truth beyond association. Those pages are not footnotes to the Wilmer identification. They are central in their own right. You can feel the file insisting on that, each folder keeping its own weight. Weight is another thing paper can carry. A single sheet weighs almost nothing, but a case file after decades can press down on a table. The accumulated pages become physical proof of effort, uncertainty, and time. You can place a hand on the stack and feel not answers exactly, but attention. That attention is one of the few things people can give when certainty has not arrived. The attention must remain gentle because the people in the case were real. It must remain precise because real people are harmed by imprecision. It must remain patient because old evidence moves slowly. And it must remain open because the unsolved portions have not given permission to close. These are quiet obligations, and they guide the way we read each page. When you look again at the Parkway map, you may notice how the road connects historic places built around memory. Jamestown, Williamsburg, Yorktown. Places where the past is preserved, interpreted, walked through, and reconsidered. It is a strange and fitting setting for a cold case, because the investigation itself became an act of preservation, not the preservation of monuments, but of names, questions, and fragile traces. History can make a landscape feel settled, but cold cases remind us that some histories are unfinished. The Colonial Parkway carries tourists through curated memory, while the case associated with it carries families through unresolved memory. Both are forms of looking back, but one has plaques and pathways, and the other has folders, evidence tape, and phone calls that begin with careful voices. You can hold that contrast quietly. The contrast does not need to be forced. It is simply there. A road built for contemplation became the center of a long investigation. A region known for visible history came to hold a hidden one. Detectives, families, and later forensic scientists spent years bringing parts of that hidden history into view. Some of it emerged. Some of it remains below the surface, like a submerged branch near a riverbank, felt only when the water moves around it. Water keeps returning in the case, not as a symbol we impose, but as a practical reality of the region. Rivers shaped travel, work, recreation, and possible offender movement. They shaped search areas and jurisdictional boundaries. They shaped the life of Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., whose connection to some victims led investigators to reconsider the watery edges of the map. You can smell that water in the file, brackish and mineral, touched by mud and weather. The watery edges complicate investigation. Evidence can be carried, degraded, hidden, or delayed by water. Shorelines change. Tides move. Access points may be known to locals but invisible to outsiders. A boat can leave fewer obvious traces than a car, especially decades ago. These facts do not solve anything by themselves, but they explain why certain leads required specialized attention. Detectives had to think like drivers and like people of the water. Thinking like someone else is part of investigation, but it has limits. You can imagine possible decisions, but you cannot know them without evidence. You can ask why a location was chosen, but the answer may be practical, impulsive, familiar, or accidental. In the Colonial Parkway case, location analysis could suggest possibilities. It could not replace proof. The road and rivers offered context, not confession. Confession itself was absent, at least in any public sense that closed the whole case. No single person sat down and explained all the pages. No trial assembled the evidence into a final public record for every victim. That absence leaves the file without the kind of narrative endpoint many people expect. Courtrooms, for all their limits, create a structure for evidence to be tested and heard. Without one, the public must rely on investigative announcements, careful distinctions, and what remains unresolved. The lack of a courtroom for Wilmer's identified cases is especially significant. Evidence could name him, but he could not be tried. Families could hear what investigators believed and why, but they could not watch the adversarial process unfold. For some, that may have been enough to bring a measure of peace. For others, it may have left a hollow place where testimony might have been. Both responses are understandable. For the remaining unsolved portions, the absence of court is simpler and harder. There is not yet a charged person to bring into that room. There is not yet a complete evidentiary path. The file remains investigative rather than adjudicated. You can feel the difference. An adjudicated case has a public structure even if questions remain. An investigative case is still gathering itself, still asking whether the next page will change the shape. And so the next page matters. It may be a tip. It may be a lab update. It may be a record request. It may be a note that nothing new has arrived. In a cold case, even a page that says little has a place, because it marks continued attention. You can imagine the date typed at the top, the agency name, the initials at the bottom. A small administrative footprint left in the long corridor of the case. The corridor remains dim, but not abandoned. You walk it slowly, as the detective tonight, and you notice the doors already opened, and the ones still closed. You do not need to force them. You only need to keep track of them. Behind one door, forensic science answered part of the story. Behind another, a missing couple still waits for location and clarity. Behind another, The earliest Parkway victims still ask for evidence strong enough to name the truth. The Colonial Parkway case, in this long, quiet view, becomes less about one failure to crack a mystery and more about the conditions that make truth difficult to retrieve. Truth needs preservation. It needs witnesses. It needs jurisdictional cooperation. It needs tools. It needs time, but not too much time. It needs language careful enough to describe partial answers. It needs people willing to keep the file open after public attention has drifted elsewhere. Public attention will always drift. That is not cruelty. It is how public life works. New stories arrive, old ones recede, but some people are appointed, formally or informally, to resist that drift. Detectives, families, archivists, advocates. They keep the case from floating too far away. You can imagine them as small, steady lights along the parkway, not bright, not dramatic, simply present through the years. Presence is a quiet virtue in cold cases. To be present to uncertainty, to be present to grief, to be present to facts that refuse to become more convenient. The Colonial Parkway case has required that presence for a very long time. It has asked investigators to keep looking without over-promising. It has asked families to keep hoping without being protected from disappointment. It has asked the public to learn the difference between attention and understanding. Understanding grows slowly here. It grows as you see why the road mattered. It grows as you see why water mattered. It grows as you see why old evidence mattered, and why missing evidence mattered just as much. It grows as you see how a name like Wilma can answer some pages and leave others untouched. It grows as you accept that the case title is a doorway, not the room itself. You may find after so many pages that your breathing has slowed with the rhythm of the file. The sentences are calm because the work is calm, even when the subject is painful. You turn the pages with care. You let each name remain distinct. You let each road and river hold its own place. The room around you is still, and the old case has not become smaller, but it has become more legible. Legibility is not closure. It is the ability to read what is there without adding too much of yourself. That is a hard skill, especially in a case that invites imagination. You may imagine the night, the road, the voices, the vehicles, the missed chances, and the later lab work. But then you return to the page. The page tells you what can be said. The blank spaces tell you what cannot. The blank spaces are where future work may enter. A record not yet found. A sample not yet testable. A witness not yet ready. A connection not yet visible. None of these should be treated as certainty, but each is a reason the open portions of the Colonial Parkway case remain alive. The file does not need dramatic hope. It needs steady availability, so that if something comes, someone is there to receive it. That receiving is another overlooked part of detective work. A tip line rings, an email arrives, a family member sends a document, a lab sends a report. Someone has to recognize whether the new thing matters. Recognition depends on knowing the old file well enough to feel when a detail fits. You can imagine the investigator pausing over a sentence, not excited exactly, but attentive, because the wording touches something remembered from another folder. The memory of investigators becomes a tool, though it too must be checked. A detective may remember a vehicle description, a name, a location, or a phrase from an old interview. Then they must verify it in the file. Human memory can guide the hand to the right drawer, but the paper must confirm what the mind recalls. In the Colonial Parkway case, after so many years, that partnership between memory and record became essential. Partnerships run through the case in many forms, between agencies, between families and investigators, between old science and new science, between the road as landscape and the file as evidence. None of these partnerships was perfect. Some were slow, some may have faltered, but the case's endurance suggests that enough people kept reaching across those gaps to keep the work possible. Possible is a modest word, and perhaps that is why it fits. Not solved, not simple, not finished. Possible. The Colonial Parkway case remained possible because evidence was preserved, because families kept speaking, because technology advanced, because investigators returned, and because unresolved names were not allowed to disappear entirely into the past. Possibility is not the same as peace, but it is something a cold file needs. As you sit with possibility, you can hear the late-night room again, the small sound of a page corner lifting, the chair settling, the faint dryness in your fingertips from handling paper. Somewhere beyond the imagined archive, the road lies under darkness, and the river moves whether anyone listens or not. The case feels old now, but not gone. It has the weight of old things that still ask to be understood. Understanding brings us back to restraint. The official connections to Wilma should be taken seriously because investigators base them on evidence. The lack of public connection to the remaining cases should also be taken seriously because careful investigators have not simply folded every page into the same answer. Both forms of seriousness protect the truth. You can hold them together, even if they pull in different emotional directions. Emotional direction is not evidentiary direction. A family may long for a single offender because it gives the story a shape. The public may prefer a single offender because it is easier to remember. Investigators may once have considered a single offender because patterns seem to suggest it. But evidence may divide the story, and when it does, the honest path follows the division. The Colonial Parkway case asks for that kind of honesty again and again. Honesty also means acknowledging the limits of our viewpoint. We are reading from outside the official file, relying on public facts and the quiet shape of the known investigation. Detectives may hold details that have never been released. Families may know nuances not present in public summaries. Evidence may exist that cannot yet be discussed. The public story is only part of the whole. A patient listener leaves room for that hidden part. Leaving room is not the same as inventing, it is a disciplined openness. You do not fill the hidden space with your preferred theory, you simply remember that it exists. In cold cases, unreleased information can be crucial. It may be the detail that verifies a confession, excludes a suspect, or protects a future prosecution. So we let some doors remain closed, and we do not mistake closed doors for empty rooms. The Colonial Parkway case has many closed doors. Some may open, some may never. The long work of detectives is to keep the keys organized, to know which doors have been tried, which hinges are rusted, which locks changed when technology changed, and which doors belong to a different hallway entirely. It is a patient image, almost domestic, but it fits the practical nature of the work. Practicality keeps returning because the case itself demands it. Look at the cars, look at the roads, look at the evidence, look at the dates, look at the names, look again. This repeated instruction is not dramatic. It is the pulse of investigation. You can feel it steadying the room, the way a quiet clock steadies a house at night. And as the clock moves, the case remains suspended between what has been learned and what has not. The learned parts deserve gratitude. The unknown parts deserve continued care. The distance between them is where detectives have spent so many years, walking carefully, carrying folders, checking notes and waiting for the next honest piece of light to appear.